There are moments in history when the balance of power doesn't shift gradually. It breaks, suddenly and without warning. On the night Operation Desert Storm began, as the skies over Baghdad erupted in fire and chaos, the world believed it understood how air wars were fought. Radar would detect. Missiles would respond. Pilots would fight their way in and out. It had always worked that way. But that night, something moved through the most heavily defended airspace on Earth, and it did so in complete silence. No warning, no interception, no resistance. The F-117 Nighthawk did not arrive like a weapon of war. It arrived like an idea no one was prepared for, and by the time anyone realized it was there, it had already struck. From the ground, the sky looked alive with violence. Tracer rounds climbed endlessly into the darkness, painting the air with fire. Surface-to-air missiles tore upward, searching, hunting, reacting to threats that pilots had spent decades learning to evade. Iraqi radar operators stared at glowing screens filled with signals, noise, and movement, trying to make sense of a battlefield that had suddenly become chaotic. But somewhere between those signals, between the noise and the expectation, was something they couldn't fully grasp. A presence that didn't behave like anything they had trained for. Because the aircraft slipping through their defenses was not trying to outrun them, it was never truly there to be seen. Inside the cockpit, the world was different. There was no chaos, no flashing explosions in every direction, no frantic maneuvering. There was only darkness, broken occasionally by faint lights on the ground far below. The mission unfolded with quiet precision. Instruments guided every movement. Coordinates replaced instinct. The pilot wasn't reacting to the battlefield. He was moving through it, untouched, almost detached, as if existing in a space just outside the war itself. And yet, every second mattered. Every angle, every second of exposure, every decision had been calculated long before takeoff. Because this aircraft, for all its revolutionary design, demanded absolute discipline in return. The F-117 Nighthawk was never meant to look like anything that could fly. Its sharp edges and faceted surfaces seemed unnatural, almost unfinished, as if it had been shaped by mathematics instead of engineering. And in a way it had. Developed in deep secrecy by Lockheed, it represented a radical idea, that survival in modern warfare didn't have to depend on speed or strength, but on absence. On reducing visibility to the point where detection became uncertain, unreliable, and eventually ineffective. It didn't make the aircraft invisible in the literal sense. It made it unlikely. And in war, probability can be the difference between life and death. For the pilots who flew it, that idea carried a strange kind of tension. Because invisibility is not something you can see or feel. You can't look out of the cockpit and confirm that you're hidden. You have to trust it. Completely. You have to believe that somewhere, on the ground below, there are people actively searching for you and failing. That belief doesn't remove fear. It changes it. It transforms it into something quieter, more controlled, but always present. A constant awareness that if something goes wrong, it will happen suddenly, without warning, and without time to react. And for a time, nothing did go wrong. Mission after mission, the aircraft performed exactly as designed. Targets deep inside heavily defended areas were struck with a level of precision that reshaped military expectations. Buildings that once required waves of bombers and enormous risk could now be destroyed with a single, carefully placed strike. The opening hours of Desert Storm sent a message that echoed far beyond the battlefield. The nature of air power had changed, not through overwhelming force alone, but through the ability to operate where others simply could not. But war has a way of answering every advantage with adaptation. And years later, under a very different sky, that silent dominance would be tested in a way no one had fully anticipated. March 27, 1999. The storm over Serbia was thick, heavy, almost suffocating. Rain blurred the landscape below, and clouds swallowed the sky, creating a darkness that felt deeper than night itself. For most aircraft, these conditions would have been a complication. For the F-117 Nighthawk, they were an opportunity. Inside the cockpit, Lieutenant Colonel Darrell Zelko guided the aircraft forward, low and steady, following a path that had been calculated with precision. His mission was clear. Strike the target. Exit undetected. Return home. At first, he was not alone. F-16 Fighting Falcon escorts moved in support, carrying missiles designed to hunt and destroy radar systems before they could become a threat. But war rarely unfolds exactly as planned. A command came through the radio, cutting through the controlled silence of the cockpit. Weather conditions worsening. Escorts ordered to return. The protective layer around him vanished in an instant. And just like that, the mission changed. Not in objective, but in risk. He was alone now, completely alone. And in that moment, the full weight of the aircraft's design became real. If it worked, he would pass through unseen. If it didn't, there would be nothing left to protect him. On the ground, in the darkness below, Zoltan Danny and his team waited. They had been watching, learning, adapting. They understood that what they were facing was not a conventional threat. It could not be tracked in the usual way. It could not be engaged using standard expectations. So they changed their approach. They relied on older systems, different frequencies, methods that were less precise, but sometimes more, revealing under the right conditions. And on that night, those conditions aligned. The radar screen flickered with noise. Rain cluttered the display. Clouds distorted signals. But buried within that chaos was something unusual. A faint return. Small, uncertain, but consistent. It didn't behave like noise. It moved with purpose. And as it grew slightly stronger, as it continued along its path, the realization set in. This was not interference. This was the target they had been waiting for. The ghost was there. High above, the mission reached its most critical moment. The bomb bay doors opened, briefly altering the aircraft's carefully controlled signature. It was a necessary action, unavoidable, built into the mission itself. But in that brief window, something changed. Just enough. Just long enough. On the ground, systems locked. Decisions were made instantly. Missiles launched into the storm, cutting upward through clouds and darkness, guided by a solution that existed for only a few seconds, but was all that was needed. Inside the cockpit, the shift was immediate. A warning tone broke the silence. Sharp, urgent, unmistakable. Missile lock. In that instant, everything changed. The calm, controlled environment collapsed into pure reaction. Zelko pulled the aircraft into evasive maneuvers, climbing, turning, pushing against forces that pressed him deep into his seat. There were no countermeasures to rely on, no flares to deploy, no simple escape. Only movement, only instinct, only seconds. The first missile passed close, close enough to be seen, close enough to confirm that the impossible was happening. The second followed, detonating nearby in a violent burst of light and fragmentation. The aircraft shuddered as shrapnel tore through its structure, ripping into the wing, breaking the delicate balance that kept it stable. Fire spread quickly, illuminating the sky in a way the aircraft had been designed to avoid at all costs. And then, control was gone. The world outside the cockpit began to spin. Fast, uncontrollably. Warning lights flashed across the instruments, each one signaling a failure, a loss, a system no longer responding. The forces on his body intensified, pushing him to the edge of consciousness. In that chaos, one reality became clear with brutal simplicity. The aircraft was no longer flyable, and if he stayed inside it, he wouldn't survive. The decision to eject is never simple. Even in training, it carries risk. At high speed, under extreme forces, with a damaged aircraft spinning through the sky, it becomes something else entirely. But there was no alternative. With strength driven by adrenaline and necessity, he reached for the ejection handles and pulled. In an instant, the cockpit exploded away, and the seat launched upward into the darkness, separating him from the machine that had defined the mission just seconds before. For a brief moment, there was nothing. No control, no direction, just the sensation of falling through space, suspended between the violence of what had just happened and the uncertainty of what would come next. Then, the parachute opened. The motion slowed. The noise faded. And below him, the wreckage of the F-117 Nighthawk burned as it fell, marking a moment that would echo far beyond that night. The silence that followed was almost surreal. Just seconds earlier, everything had been noise, motion, urgency, systems failing, alarms screaming, forces pulling in every direction. Now, suspended beneath a parachute in the darkness, there was only wind and the distant glow of fire far below. Lieutenant Colonel Darrell Zelko breathed heavily, his mind racing to catch up with what had just happened. The most advanced stealth aircraft ever built had been struck. The mission had succeeded, but the illusion of invulnerability had been shattered in an instant. As he descended, reality began to set in with a different kind of weight. He was no longer a pilot inside a machine designed to protect him. He was alone, exposed, drifting into hostile territory. Every second in the air felt longer than it should, each movement of the parachute a reminder that he was visible now in a way the aircraft had never been. And then he noticed it. The color. Bright. Impossible to miss. Against the darkness of the landscape, his parachute stood out like a signal, announcing his position to anyone looking up. The same sky that had hidden him moments ago was now revealing him completely. He hit the ground hard, the impact cutting through the calm that had briefly settled in. Instinct took over immediately. There was no time to process, no time to reflect. He gathered himself, moved quickly, scanning the area for any sign of movement or threat. The terrain was unfamiliar, the darkness uneven, broken only by distant lights and the occasional flash of activity. Somewhere out there, people were already searching. He knew it. The downing of the aircraft would not go unnoticed. It would spread quickly, drawing attention, drawing forces, turning the area into a hunt. He found a shallow ditch and moved into it, pressing himself low against the ground, covering himself with mud in an attempt to break up his outline. It was a simple tactic, almost primitive compared to the technology he had been relying on minutes earlier. But now, simplicity was survival. Stillness was survival. He slowed his breathing, controlled every movement, listening more than looking. The sounds around him grew sharper in the darkness. The distant rumble of vehicles, voices carried by the wind, the subtle shifts of movement in the terrain. Time stretched. Minutes felt like hours. And then, a new sound. Closer. Uncertain. Something moving through the vegetation nearby. His body tensed instantly, every sense focusing on that single point. The sound grew louder, more deliberate, accompanied by a different rhythm, breathing, heavy and uneven. A dog, close enough now that he could hear it clearly, sense its presence just beyond the edge of his hiding place. He reached slowly for his knife, weighing the decision in silence. If the animal alerted others, it would be over. But if he acted, if he made even the smallest mistake, it could bring exactly the attention he was trying to avoid. For a moment, everything balanced on that decision. Then, unexpectedly, the dog turned away. The sound faded. The danger passed as quietly as it had arrived. He remained still, barely allowing himself to breathe, until he was certain the moment was gone. It was a small victory, almost insignificant in the larger situation, but it was enough to keep him alive a little longer. Then, through the quiet, a new sound broke through, faint at first, almost indistinguishable from the background noise. A crackle. Static. His radio. He brought it closer, listening carefully, adjusting it with controlled movements. And then he heard it. A voice. Distant, but clear enough to understand. Rescue forces were in the area. They were searching for him. Hope is a powerful thing, but in that moment, it came with its own risks. Responding too soon, too loudly, could expose his position. Waiting too long could mean missing the only chance he had. He scanned the darkness again, checking for movement, for light, for any indication that the area was clear enough to risk communication. The balance between survival and rescue narrowed to a single decision. When he finally responded, his voice was controlled, measured, giving just enough information to guide them without drawing unnecessary attention. The exchange was brief, efficient. Coordinates. Confirmation. A plan. Somewhere above, beyond the clouds and the darkness, a helicopter adjusted its course, moving toward a location that existed only as a fragile connection between voice and signal. But nothing about the situation was simple. The equipment meant to guide the rescue failed to function as expected. The infrared strobe, designed to make him visible only to those equipped to see it, refused to work. Time slipped away, and with it, the margin for error. The sounds around him were changing again. Closer now. More organized. Search efforts intensifying. He made a decision that went against everything the aircraft had represented. Instead of remaining hidden, he would make himself visible. He reached for the flare, knowing exactly what it meant. The moment it ignited, the darkness around him disappeared, replaced by a harsh, unmistakable light. His position, once concealed, was now exposed to anyone within range. For a brief moment, the world around him became clear: terrain, shadows, movement, all illuminated in stark contrast. The helicopter saw it, adjusted, descended rapidly. At the same time, the light drew attention from the ground. Flashlights shifted. Voices rose. Movement accelerated toward the same point. What had been a silent search became a race. Seconds mattered now in a way they hadn't before. The helicopter touched down just long enough. The crew moved with precision, pulling him in, assessing him in a matter of seconds. There was no time for anything more. As quickly as it had arrived, it lifted off again, disappearing back into the darkness, leaving behind a field that would soon be filled with those who had come just a moment too late. For the world watching from a distance, the event carried a different meaning. The downing of the F-117 Nighthawk was not just a battlefield incident, it was a shock. For years, the aircraft had represented a near-mythical advantage, a capability that seemed to operate beyond the reach of conventional defenses. Its loss raised questions, sparked analysis, and challenged assumptions. How could something designed to avoid detection be found? How could something built to survive such environments be brought down? The answers were complex, layered, and deeply rooted in the nature of technological evolution. Stealth had never been absolute. It had always been about reducing probability, about shaping outcomes in ways that favored survival. But probability is never zero. And in war, even the smallest window can be enough. Yet focusing only on that moment risks missing the larger story. Because long before that night, the F-117 Nighthawk had already proven what it was capable of in a way that reshaped expectations entirely. In 1991, during the Gulf War, the aircraft entered a battlefield unlike any before it. Iraq's air defense network was dense, layered, and designed specifically to counter the kinds of threats that had defined previous wars. Radar coverage overlapped. Missile systems were positioned strategically. Anti-aircraft artillery created a constant presence in the skies above critical areas. It was, by all accounts, a system built to detect and respond. And yet, on the opening night of the conflict, something extraordinary happened. The first strikes against the most heavily defended targets were carried out not by overwhelming force, but by precision. A small number of aircraft, operating under conditions that maximized their advantage, penetrated deep into the defense network without triggering the kind of response that planners had once considered inevitable. Command centers were hit. Communication systems disrupted. Strategic targets neutralized. For those observing from the outside, it looked almost unreal. The scale of destruction did not match the scale of the visible effort. There were no massive formations dominating the sky, no prolonged engagements unfolding in dramatic fashion. Instead, there was a quiet efficiency, a level of control that suggested something fundamentally different was at work. That difference lay not just in the aircraft itself, but in what it represented. The idea that technology could reshape the battlefield not by increasing force, but by changing how and when that force was applied. By allowing access where access had previously been denied. By turning the act of detection from a certainty into a question. Over time, that idea spread beyond a single platform. It influenced the development of future systems, informed new strategies, and became a defining element of modern air power. But it all traced back to those first moments, when the F-117 Nighthawk demonstrated that the rules were no longer fixed. And even in its most vulnerable moment, falling from the sky years later, that reality did not disappear. If anything, it became clearer. Because the story was never about perfection. It was about change, about how quickly it could happen, and how deeply it could reshape expectations. Today, the aircraft itself no longer flies in active combat, but its legacy remains embedded in everything that followed. In the design of modern stealth platforms, in the way missions are planned, in the understanding that control of the air is no longer just about power, it is about presence, perception, and the ability to operate in ways that are not immediately understood. And perhaps that is what made those moments so powerful. Not just the strikes that were never seen, or the aircraft that moved undetected through defended skies, but the realization that something fundamental had shifted. That war, as it had been understood for decades, had entered a new phase. A phase where silence could be more effective than speed, where precision could outweigh numbers, and where the most important advantage might be the one no one can see. If you found this story as compelling as the events themselves, and you want to see more deep, cinematic breakdowns like this, stories that explore not just what happened, but why it mattered, consider subscribing to the channel. And if this video gave you a new perspective, leaving a like helps more people discover it.